Awesome. Good day, everyone. My name is Kyle Paul, and welcome to Between the Brackets. This month on our show, I am joined by April Kyle Nassi and Mark Mandel, who will be my awesome co-hosts today as we talk about open source gaming at Google. This is a live show with real experts talking about fun and niche developer topics. Feel free to invite others to tune in and make sure to ask your questions in the YouTube live chat over there on the side. And let us know what you would like us to cover next time by filling out our survey at Google, so goo.gle/B2B-survey. With that, I'd like to welcome our guests, April Kyle Nassi and Mark Mandel, to the stage. Welcome.
Hello.
Hello.
Awesome. It's great having both of you. Thanks you for taking the time out of your days.
Thank you so much. Thank you also for referring to me as an expert. I appreciate that. That makes me feel good.
Yes. Well, yeah, that's why we reached out.
I can't have any more go to his head. That's fine.
Awesome. Well, I'm super excited to have both of you here. We do have open source has been a massive topic within our developer community here in North America and around the world. And with learning more about open source gaming, this was something that was more new to me as well. So I'm very excited to learn a lot more about this topic and how we deal with open source gaming at Google. So can you tell, this is to either you, Mark, or April, if you want to dive in and let us know how the gaming industry is different than our typical web industry or mobile app industry. How would this be different?
I'm gonna let Mark do that because that's his wheelhouse.
Okay, that works. I don't mind either way. So this is interesting. So yeah, so we both April and I work quite a lot at the intersection of the gaming industry and open source. And the games industry, it's an interesting beast. And I think culturally speaking, and I'd love to hear people who disagree with this, but culturally speaking, I feel like a lot of them came from very different places. So I feel like sort of, web tech, infra tech, the internet, it sort of culturally comes from the idea of like the internet, which was sort of built to be open and built to be shared, and like this sort of culture of sharing and openness and transparency. And I think that fed into open source. That's sort of a general gut feel as I think of it. And so like, it's very common, especially all of us that work in infrastructure, for us to leverage, build, work on these open foundations and these open sort of platforms that we all utilize. And it is not strange in any way, shape, or form if like I'm presenting something to be at a conference and be like, okay, so I did this thing and it's like, great. And here's my GitHub repository with all the code and everything I did, right? Like that's a very normal experience. The games industry didn't necessarily come out of that same cultural environment in many ways. And so the phrase I like to use is a quick sort of shorthand quip as partially a joke is like, it feels like general web tech is kind of socialist and like the gaming industry is very capitalist, right? So there's a huge culture of secrecy. There's a huge culture of proprietary tech. I feel like some of this is changing, but like, yeah, for example, if you went to a gaming conference and they were going to like do a presentation about something, they would talk about the general concepts, but they wouldn't necessarily be like, here's the code. Like, nope. Or like even to a degree where I've had it where they were like, hey, we're deliberately not talking about products in this talk that we've used, which I find very strange coming from my background in general, like infrastructure and web stuff. And so that kind of environment is different. And I think also to note as well, there's a few differences there as well. Like the development patterns are different, right? Traditionally speaking, you start a game, it's practically greenfield. You make technical decisions at the beginning. You probably stick to those for like 3 years because that's your development cycle on a game, right? You run that gamut, you release the game, boom, you're done. And then you start a whole new game 3 years later and you pick a whole new tech stack. Maybe some sharing, but not necessarily from before. So that maintenance burden is a little different. We've seen some change with that as like your long-term is what we call like games as a service. So games that are like online or have like multiple DLCs, like so downloadable content or long-term online campaigns. April loves Destiny. Oh no, sorry, Final Fantasy XIV, whatever Final Fantasy version is up right now. I don't know. I don't play Final Fantasy. Sorry, but like we see some of that kind of stuff happen, and I mean, the classic example is World of Warcraft's been around forever and ever and ever. So we do see some of that maintenance stuff come through, but from a very traditional perspective, like it's very, very internal, very, like we have proprietary tech. This is how we build it. A lot of reinvention of the wheel, that kind of stuff. So yeah,
I think that's probably one thing that's the most different is, like you said, the reinvention of the wheel of, we built this awesome thing that we used for this game. We're going to do another game. Well, we're just going to build it again. Or, we're going to, keep doing this each time. We don't trust anything that was built outside of this studio per se. So that is very much opposite of what open source is and the open source philosophy. So it is not an industry that has kind of, organically picked up open source. It's had to be kind of a conscious effort to grow it and spread it. And that's part of what we've been doing. So.
Is that where you feel that certain game engines that were very proprietary initially, is that kind of following the same flow that you were talking about, where they realized they were reinventing the wheel every time, and so they started to go in and create these game engines that they started to render things upon, but it's still reinventing the wheel every single time as they release a new game? Does that kind of fit in the same flow?
I mean, engines are a little different because that's what a game designer is building on top of. Okay. More of what we're seeing is the infrastructure side. So it is I've built this amazing game. Now I need to get it out to millions of people. And it's that back end that goes into that. And that's a lot of the open source projects that we've done thus far. There are a lot of game engines that are open source or are, well, I shouldn't say a lot, or,
kind of several.
Right.
Dozens. There are dozens of us.
Dozens.
But there's also some that are, source available. I know Hillary on a previous episode got all into open source licenses. So there's a whole bunch of different stuff around that. But I think also there's that different element of when you're a game designer, there is that benefit of having an engine that's open source because you're able to, one, have some say over the development of the engine and new capabilities and things that come in. And you also get that level of comfort, especially if you're an indie dev, you're not a AAA studio, which maybe we should explain what a AAA studio is. But, you're able to kind of trust in a certain way that like the rug's not going to get pulled out from under you. And when you are just an indie dev, that's a big deal. You don't have a bunch of money that you can easily pick up and go to another engine if you need to. So that, I think, is where some of that we're seeing a lot more of the open source engines like Godot and is it Amethyst is the other one?
There's Amethyst in the Rust space. There's like Amethyst, Bevy, R3GD. Then there's whatever Zenko is called these days. Default, the one that I think came out of King, their 2D engine.
And then there's the O3DE that just came out with the Linux Foundation. So I think you're seeing a lot more of that. Like that's a good building block. That's almost like the gateway to open source gaming and puts the idea out there. And there's games that are open source, but not so much the extent of the full infrastructure, which it feels like we probably need to explain what a AAA is when we say that. And then also, Mark, you probably need to explain what game infrastructure is. And
I have lots of thoughts even on the open source side. So yes, so I have so many thoughts. I can't get them all out. No, yeah. So so people are aware for like every industry has its own jargon. Indie tends to be your smaller studios. What is indie is like a whole conversation in of itself, but generally speaking, smaller studios, like not necessarily huge amounts of people.
Or just a couple of people.
It could just be anything. I mean, 10, 15. I mean, indie could be 20. Like independently published is usually how that usually gets phrased. Although not necessarily these days. Anyway, so let's just go with sort of smaller studios, reduced resources. Let's go with that. Versus your AAA, which would, be your enterprise companies. So I'm trying to think of good examples. There's so many good examples. Like AAA is like your Ubisoft or EA, like all that kind of stuff. Yeah. Your indies, there are so many. I'm trying to think about like, how can I not think of a good indie game? I can think of good indie games. There are
Among Us.
Among Us is a great example. I think the team that came out with Hades is a small indie studio.
Untitled Goose Game.
Yeah, all that kind of stuff that have definitely been hits. And each has its own sort of requirements for various reasons, much in the same way, like if you're a startup versus a giant enterprise, like it's very different in that kind of stuff too. I don't know. I totally blanked on indie games. I don't know what.
Mark doesn't actually play video games. It's all an act.
I don't know what's going on.
He just builds his own games.
Right.
Yeah,
He just buys them and that's it. He doesn't actually play. Yeah.
I buy a lot of indie games. I was playing Whisker Squadron the other day. That's like an upcoming indie game. Anyway, it's cute and it has good sound. And what was I going to say? So we're talking about open source engines.
Yeah, dive into infrastructure and what that means a little bit more. And thank you, April, for calling that out. Because I wanted to help.
Can I touch on something with engines? Just real quick as well, because I think there's also another important point there. It's something I've been harping on about for a while as well. That is something that in general us as web, like at the web tech side, don't encounter, which is consoles. So, which is a whole other thing. So, if I'm a web developer, let's say for argument's sake, or even a mobile developer to a degree, I know what all my standards are. I know what my tools are, right? If I want to push it, like there's no one saying like, hey, you can't push this to an HTML page. Like that's not a thing. Or this is the tools and technologies you can use to push to a mobile device, right? Like there is some of that to a mobile to a degree, but it's all open and like there's all kinds of infrastructure around that and it's all documented and whatnot. On the game side, if you want to push code to a console, you need to have a partner agreement or some kind of contract. It's under an NDA, so we don't know what's behind it if you've actually done it. And it's restrictive on what tools and what things you can use based on that platform, and they're all different. That makes things incredibly difficult on the open source engine side to be able to support that, because even if they do support that, they can't tell you about it because it's behind an NDA. And that makes it really difficult especially if I'm an indie developer and I'm like, hey, I want to make a game. And if it's a hit, I want to make sure it's on as many platforms as possible. I might look at something like a Unity or an Unreal, some sort of licensed engine that I know has a company behind it that already has those relationships with those console developers. That's a safer bet for me. Versus if I'm doing it in an open source engine, there may be people who have done the porting work. There may not be. I look at Godot specifically. They're probably one of, I think I would argue they are definitely one of the most prevalent open source engines out there. They have third-party companies that do this work. I'm sure they're great, that kind of stuff. But like if I'm an indie company, I'm looking at that and going, okay, I need to A, look at the engine and be like, I'm happy with it, and that's great. But B, I need to go vet an extra third party to make sure that if I want to go to console, it all works. And I'm sure they're fantastic and wonderful, but it's just that extra touch point that I need to go through that could be a friction point. So that is a struggle. Microsoft released some stuff around what they call their GDK recently. So it seems like they're starting to open up some of that kind of stuff as well. If anyone who works at Sony or Microsoft is listening, if we can do this on phones, we should be able to do this on consoles. So I would love to see this area open up more. Yes. Because I think it would. There's so much really cool and interesting work happening in the engine space and open source. And many of the friends who may be listening to this have already heard me harp on about this to them, who work at those companies, etc. And I'll keep beating that drum and for as long as I can. But the more we can open it up, the more innovation we can see in the space for sure. Sorry. Awesome. Now we can move on.
No, very cool.
I had to get my rant out.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing your insights there and explaining a little bit more about engines. We did have a couple comments in the chat. One of them was suggesting another indie game about Slay the Spire.
Slay the Spire's great.
And then we did have one user here, Sahil. He mentioned that he's used Godot and he thinks it's really good for beginners. Would you agree that's a great beginner engine to kick off with?
I have never used it, so I cannot agree or disagree. But I have seen other people use it and enjoy it. So give it a shot.
Yeah, I've heard a lot of the similar sentiment. I think also it's one of the advantages of it being open source is it's a lot easier if you are a beginner to just pick it up and like tinker. Whereas if you're going to a proprietary engine, like Mark mentioned, you may not have to do an NDA, but you probably have to fill out a form or, sign up for something. And so that a lot of times can be just a barrier to people. And so that's one of the great things about open source is that it's there. Go grab it. You don't have to tell anybody you're doing it. You're free to kind of play around. So
awesome.
Yeah, one thing that I have definitely seen around Godot is if you're in an environment where you have reduced bandwidth, which like some of the listeners may be, they may not necessarily be somewhere like the US where like bandwidth is great, is huge. Godot is a much smaller like size to download. I think I actually have to look. It's like less than 100 megabytes. I think I actually have to don't quote me on that. I have to double check it. But versus like the gigabytes that can be some other proprietary engines, so that can be just a factor that can sort of get you started in a certain direction that at least gets you moving.
Awesome. Very cool. Well, thanks for, going and exploring that path on engines and stuff like that. So that kind of helps set the tone for the audience on in April. Thank you also for acknowledging the difference between infrastructure and the engine, because one of the things that both of you work on is actually the infrastructure side. And so that's where we're separating this out. And, as game developers, one of the things that many of us that just play the games, we all hear about the engines. We never really hear about the infrastructure side. So can you dive in a little bit more, like what you're working on at Google on the infrastructure side here?
Mark is the godfather of open source gaming at Google. He is far too humble about that. But essentially it was one of those things where I think most open source projects start this way of it's one person that's like, hey, that's a problem. I want to fix it. And then you can find someone else that wants to fix it with you. And then it snowballs. And then eventually it's magic, right? And so I think with particularly infrastructure, it's definitely, it's not the cool part of game development, right? Like, it's not the audio. I'm sorry. It's not the audio. It's not, the game mechanics or design. But it is incredibly important because it is like when your game becomes a wild success overnight and your servers start falling over, oh no, what do you do? And it's things like that people don't really think about until it happens. And then when it happens, you're in that, like, everything's on fire. Oh gosh, I need an answer right now. And so, that's hopefully a good segue for Mark to talk about how he came up with Agones, which is, we call it basically shorthand is Kubernetes for game servers. And hopefully, I'm sure everyone knows Kubernetes, right? Because it's just Kubernetes.
Sure, it's Kubernetes.
Yeah, we've had a previous episode where we talked a little bit about Kubernetes. And so if you haven't caught up on Kubernetes, you can watch one of our previous episodes. But we might have a future episode dedicated purely to Kubernetes. But go ahead, Mark. Tell us a little bit more about Agones.
Yeah, so one of the first projects probably that we started with open source infrastructure for gaming was Agones, which I was one of the founders or a founder of. And I'm just trying to think where I want to start with this. So one of the very, very common thing, right? So if you're playing any kind of multiplayer game where lots of people play together, a very common pattern is what we often refer to as what's called dedicated game servers. And we don't have to go super down this rabbit hole. But like if you're playing like an Overwatch or Fortnite or any of those types of games, quite often what they currently run is basically, I have some software running in the cloud. It's a full simulation of everything that's happening in the game. We all connect to it. And that's how we share state about like who's doing what inside the game. And there's a lot of really good reasons why it works that way. And the common pattern that I was seeing around the time, this was probably 3 or 4 years ago now, maybe even before, was a lot of companies and infrastructure groups that were working inside, especially AAA game studios, were sort of doing this sort of check to see, hey, what stuff's out there for running game servers in the cloud? They have some kind of unique lifecycle stuff because it's all in memory state. So you can't shut them down when players are playing on them, but you can't shut them down when no one's playing on them. Yeah, players get mad when you shut down their game servers for no reasons, whatever, that kind of stuff. And so they were sort of running around doing that. And I'd come from sort of the infra side, but I was digging more into gaming at the time and trying to fill that gap. And was realizing like this was just a common pattern. And I think this is, a common story about open source, right? April just said, right? Someone just goes, I keep seeing everyone rebuilding this thing and that seems silly. And I come from a history of open source. And so anytime I see a problem that I'm like watching 14 people all build the same thing, like it hurts me in my soul. And so had been doing a bunch of research around this topic, presenting at conferences, putting out a bunch of content, sort of just talking about containers, game servers, can it run on Kubernetes, that kind of stuff. And if you're not familiar with Kubernetes, it is just a bunch of software for running software on top of a lot of machines. That's really all it is. Yeah, in containers. But like, that's an like if you've never touched it, like that's it. Like if you have 100 machines and you want to make sure that software runs on it, Kubernetes is the thing that helps you do that. You can go deep down that rabbit hole, but that'll happen. So I was seeing that. I was seeing Kubernetes was open source. I was seeing the sort of infrastructure and the investment we had there with Google. And I was like, that seems like a platform that we should be able to run game servers on with like some tweaking and like some little changes and stuff like that. So as per everything, I think, that sort of has happened. I was in a casual conversation with some people at Ubisoft and sort of was like, hey, we're talking about doing this thing internally, that kind of stuff about like game servers running Kubernetes. And they ended up getting back in contact and saying, hey, like this sounds like a really cool idea. Let's do it. So did some internal red tape, et cetera, started building it, showed it to the world. People were like, this seems cool. It's been 4 years going. And honestly, unfortunately, gaming secrecy. Can't tell you all the people that use it. But the phrase I've been using recently is like, if you've played a multiplayer game in the last year or two, it's entirely possible it might be running on this deck. It's definitely been well adopted. And from there, us at Google Google Cloud for Games, I think is the moniker we're using these days. We've expanded that out to Project OpenSaves. There's another project OpenMatch, another project I work on, Quilkin. And each of those projects, we work with other game companies to help initially build and then continue to grow from there as a collaboration exercise. What's the phrase I like to use? We bring our knowledge of open source and community building and infrastructure, from the Google side, and then, work with game companies with their understanding of like game publishing and game infrastructure needs and what they need from gaming, and push it together and make magic happen.
Nice. Well, I want to dive in a little bit on one thing about the game server Agones. You were mentioning a multiplayer game. Is this real-time multiplayer or is this any kind of multiplayer? So real-time multiplayer is where this game engine focuses. Game server focuses.
Yeah, generally speaking, it's sort of it's your fast-paced, competitive, real-time multiplayer type stuff, where like latency is super important. But that's going down the rabbit hole of like what Agones does and that kind of stuff. And we can, right. I'm happy to do it. Don't get me wrong. But I want to make sure that we stay on topic and stick to what we want.
For sure. Yeah. That was just one of the things that I wanted to help clarify for the audience too, is that it's real time. And so that way, when you're engaging with other players in the game world, whatever the game happens to be, it's that real time multiplayer. It's not necessarily just, these other people are logged in and potentially playing at random states.
Yeah. And it's been sort of at a higher level. It's been super interesting. And there's so many ways that I think it's super interesting, and April can definitely attest to some of this too, around like engaging with studios and people that aren't used to transparency and openness, and some of the culture things that we've had to do there. It's also been really interesting to see the gatherings of people who aren't necessarily used to gathering together, and getting them in the same place has been really delightful. I love the fact that open source is just this centralizing thing that brings knowledge to a single place and enables people to sort of gather and bring like shared experience together in both a technical sense, but also in a community sense. There's just lots of really lovely things that have sort of come out of a lot of this work.
Awesome. Very cool.
Yeah. Yeah. I think, one of the questions that we get a lot is like, well, why does Google do this? Because we do have, some of our open source projects that Google has created, which Google has so many.
Lots.
We are
a big
fan.
Going to be my follow-up question. So.
Yeah, like why a big fan of open source. Yeah, and so some of that is just part of Google's culture, right? Like we have a very, contrary to pretty much a lot of other things, being able to open source code at Google is actually quite easy. We give Googlers a lot of leeway with that. There is the aspect of, sure, this is something that we saw a need for and we, built something on it, and then maybe a product is built on top of it, because of course we would love every game to be running on Google, game servers. But, ultimately what we're trying to do is just grow that community, and, build those relationships with folks that are in the industry for that kind of knowledge sharing. One of the things that the second project we had was OpenMatch, which is a matchmaking framework. So when you play a game, and you're doing like that random matchmaking, whether it's like something like Destiny, where you have Crucible, playing against other players, and you're just randomly assigned a group of people. So that kind of a thing. There's a whole lot of different factors that go into that, into the methodology for, is it grabbing someone that's, just as good as you, or are they far away or close away? OpenMatch helps build that framework. Basically, you're able to, do your own formula, but OpenMatch is the framework. And that again was, a Google engineer, Joseph Hawley, having a conversation with someone at Unity, and they both were like, yeah, we really need this. And then, hello, it's a new project. And one of the great things about that is OpenMatch is, now at this stage where it's been used in a lot of games. If you recall the Google Doodle from I don't remember, was it 3 years ago for Halloween, where you were
yes, that's right,
compete against each other? That was using OpenMatch. And because it is something that we're doing with Unity, Unity's matchmaking product is built on top of OpenMatch. And one of the great things about that project, and why it's one of my favorites, don't tell the others, is because it is that combination of people in the industry that are coming together and talking about things that, like Mark said, don't normally get talked about. And it's pretty amazing. You join one of our community meetings, shameless plug, every month, and you're able to have this conversation with folks that are working at Unity, folks that are working at 2K Games. This is not, you don't get that kind of access just normally. Even if you went to a conference, you're not going to be able to necessarily make those kind of connections. Whereas open source is a huge way to just jump in, and suddenly you're connecting to people that are working at game studios that are building some of the games and love. And so that, I think, is something that's really great about open source. Speaking of, I got involved with all of this because I've always been a gamer. And when Mark started working with Agones, it was kind of like, well, this might be a thing. Google might start doing this. And I was in the open source programs office, and the idea came up of where okay, we might need someone to kind of focus on this open source gaming thing. And I was like, hi, I spend a lot of time playing video games. I might be interested in this. So, it's been really great for me, who is not a developer, to be able to learn more about, the infrastructure and the back end. Because I did have more, I did have more exposure into kind of the making of, in the sense of engines and audio and design, but didn't have the infrastructure background. And to be able to have conversations with folks at Unity and 2K, et cetera, all these, big studios that we're familiar with, is huge. And that is open source. That's the great thing about it. So I definitely would say, I call on OpenMatch because the project itself is very much at this point where it's good to go as it is. You can use it in production. A lot of games are. We're not actively adding a bunch of features to it because right now it's good. It's go use it. But we do still have, these great conversations. And that's one of the things that, amongst those of us that have worked on it, we've said, if nothing else, the fact that we've built these connections and have this kind of community and relationship around it is huge and worth more than anything. And so that, I think, speaks to, the kind of the power of open source, and then it also speaks to just at a big scale, why does Google do open source? Well, this is exactly it, because, it's not just about us. It's about the bigger industries and, what we can do, the knowledge that we have and the scale that we have, we can bring to other areas and help folks get started and grow that and expand that. So that's my open source soapbox. I see Renee asked a question about being nervous about open source and first time. One thing that I always say is join a meeting, You can sit and lurk, whether it's our projects or anyone else's. We will not force you to say hello, but we might. But like everybody's generally very friendly, and generally when you're looking at a new project, like just join a meeting. They all have meetings. A lot of times it'll be a broad-based community meeting where it's, sometimes like Kubernetes is a great example of, a giant meeting with a lot of people, and they're going to talk more about cool stuff that's happened within the project. Ours are more of like, let's talk about what we're all working on. And then at some point we'll veer off into talking about dogs or coffee mugs and the games we play. Like it just goes in a number of different directions. But, you get that chance to, hear from other people and kind of get a sense of what's going on. And from there, you can kind of judge what might be a good spot for you to get involved in. Even if you're not a developer, this is another big thing that I say, like if you're someone who's interested in, working in a game development or just working in anything, open source needs tons of contributions that aren't code. Doc writing is the number one. Every project will just love you forever if you can contribute to their documentation. But also there's a lot of things like, volunteering to run a social media account or to help coordinate, a project, or even just coordinating, if there's a new release coming up, maybe someone needs to kind of keep an eye on what's coming in and, keep the maintainers from focusing on certain things and, make sure we cover the broad picture, or just harassing them to reply to issues. Totally not calling Mark out in this at all.
I respond to issues mostly.
But yeah, so, things like that, things that you wouldn't necessarily think of, like that's a totally valid open source contribution. And we would all love to have it. It's not just code. It's that simple kind of like, hey, I can see, even if you just file an issue and are like, hey, your getting started documentation is confusing, hugely helpful. So I would say, go for it. Everyone, obviously, I can't say everyone will be nice. Mark's got a t-shirt telling everyone be kind. But most people are. And, open source is built on community, and open source is built on people. That's what we always say, like open source is about people. And so, find the projects you're interested in, just kind of jump in, lurk for a while, and then, you'll find a good spot that you're interested in. And I know I always volunteer this. I will do it. Mark will do it. Like we're happy to help folks, get started in open source, whether it's our projects or anything else. But like, this is something that people tend to think, I don't know how to code. I don't know how to do X, Y, Z. I don't know this language and things like that, but there's still so much more you can do. So I think now I am off my soapbox.
I'll riff on that a little bit. There's a couple of things in there I think that are worth, like, as a putting my maintainer hat on, who deals with like a maintainer stuff a lot. There's two things I'd love to add to that. One, open source is a community, right? Think of it like you're stepping into a party where you don't know anyone. Start small. You meet a couple of people. You build some credibility. You build some trust. You get to know people. So if you're doing small things first, and you can slowly grow from there, like that generally is how you build your social circle, right? It's exactly the same in that kind of way. I will say one small thing as a maintainer that for me is like, if you show that when you say that you're going to do something and you follow through and do it, or even especially if you show initiative in the first place, even if the initiative is in the wrong direction to a degree, like if you show initiative that you're willing to put in the time, like if you're like, I've put in some time and effort, I've learned these 3 things and I'm curious about this stuff over here, I will put time into you 100%. Unfortunately, as a maintainer, what often happens is I like people will message me directly and be like, hey, what should I be working on now? And I'll be honest, I've never, like if someone's brand new to a project, anytime I put time and effort into like being like, hey, like these are the issues we're working on, or like working with their skill set and stuff, they've never followed through. Like it's never, ever actually happened. So these days, if someone comes to me and says, hey, what should I be working on? Usually I say to them, what do you want to be working on? What needs do you have? Go find that for yourself and then go work on that. And if then they come back, which often generally also doesn't happen, because it's only one person out of 20 that actually comes back. who does that, then you're like, okay, you've put investment in here, because we're all working for free, right? In many ways, I mean, I'm not, I get paid, which is lovely, but most people are working for free. But because the community and the diversity of people who come through is so wide, and they don't have to stay, they can come do a thing and then leave again, totally acceptable. You don't have to be there forever. Then, you know, as a maintainer, considering my own burnout and considering like the amount of spoons that I have to put into people, I have to be very tactical about it. But yeah, if you show that you have the time and effort and the impetus to do it yourself, even if it's just the beginning, and even if it's wrong, that's also totally fine. That puts you up above 99% of the people in the community.
Yeah. And that's where I was going to add in there. Typically on these open source projects, they have the list of the issues that, you know, as a first, as a beginner, you look at the issues that people are having and see if you could tackle any of those and contribute that back to the project. I know certain projects have a tag for first timers. Yep. So that way, if you're new to open source or new to that particular style of development, you know, these are tags that you should look for on GitHub and other repos to, you know, if you want to get into that space. That's something else that I've seen as well.
Absolutely.
Yes.
I would also say, like, don't be gatekept on that, right? They're suggestions, not dogma. I will honestly say most people who submit to open source, especially in a drive-by fashion, are driven by need. Like, I need this thing, and I feel very strongly that I need this thing, so I have strong incentive to build this thing. It doesn't matter whether it has a good first issue or not on it. They're just guides.
Yeah.
Definitely. We did have a question from Random Dev here. So as a new game developer, is there a book or a guide that all of you would recommend to get started with? And I assume, you know, this is more geared towards the infrastructure side. So,
well, that would be my first question. What part of game development do you want to work on? Because it is wide and varied.
So I think I would direct this to April first, because, you know, you were mentioning that you came from the design side, like you had an understanding of the engine and stuff, but infrastructure was completely new to you. How did you get started? Where would you, what helped launch you into the infrastructure space?
A lot of it is listening to Mark, and I kind of am forced to, but I tease because I love it. We have a ton of content in terms of like presentations that have been given around, you know, Agones, of course, and then more around some of the other projects. There's also GDC, which is not something that just anybody can go to. It's the Game Developers Conference for folks that aren't aware, and it is very much, you know, it is expensive. So there are some elements of the content there that get shared elsewhere. So there's a lot of, you know, those kind of resources. And then who's the guy that has the blog post, Mark, that you always, Gaffer on Games?
There's Gaffer. Yeah. Like, if you want to learn specifically about like network.
Did we lose Mark?
Hopefully we didn't.
No, yeah, Gaffer on Games is definitely a resource that it is more of like the networking aspect, which is one of the new open source projects we have that specifically focuses on that. But yeah, I think it's one of those that, again, because it is so secretive, it's not necessarily something that you can just pick up a book and run with. There are, however, specific programs like the Rochester Institute of Technology, for instance, has a entire like program on, you know, game development. And they also have a really good open source component involved. The guy who's been running that program has been heavily involved with open source, and they teach a lot around that. And there's also the International Game Developers Association, which is nonprofit, very member driven. We do a lot of work with them as well in terms of, you know, helping, you know, teach and get the message out basically about different aspects of game development and different pieces that go into it. So it is very much one of those things that, you know, you kind of have to hunt for some of the resources. There's not specifically necessarily one thing we can point to. And because it is such a broad space, even in infrastructure, you know, it's kind of, you got to figure out what you're interested in there. Is it something like Agones where you're interested in like, you know, servers and scaling that up? Is it Open Match where it's, you know, the matchmaking framework? The other projects we have is Open Saves, which is a relatively new one that we did with 2K Games. NBA 2K, all those good ones. And that is literally, the kind of cloud saves functionality, which, we obviously did it with games in mind, but it can be extended to any number of different things. And then the most recent one is Quilkin, which is a proxy basically for game servers that can help with, some of those fun things like, being, we mentioned Final Fantasy. My beloved Final Fantasy recently had a DDoS attack last weekend on their European servers. So there's that aspect as well that you can look into, which now that Mark has joined us again, Mark can tell us all about Quilkin, his latest project.
Sorry.
That he started.
Of course, my internet went out in the middle of this so I'm hotspotting off my phone. So tell me if it ends up being terrible. What was the topic of conversation, by the way?
Quilkin, our lovely Quilkin.
Quilkin's an interesting project. It's a little complicated, and so I'll give you that proviso in the beginning. The Quilkin's another fun collaboration. So we built this in collaboration and continue to build this in collaboration with Embark Studios, which is I would refer to them probably as mid-size. I would ask them how they classify themselves because I want to be respectful. Studio in Malmo. A lot of ex-devs from AAA. They actually, if you go check them out, they do a lot of amazing work in open source, particularly in the Rust ecosystem. They're super cool crew and very, very smart individuals. Quilkin is a proxy for game servers. So the analogy I like to use is very much how we all, I don't know if we all is the right word, but there was a increase in say going from monoliths to microservices in sort of web and mobile tech for a long time. That's a whole other topic. But traditionally speaking, I work a lot with dedicated game servers. They tend to be monolithic applications. They're usually actually tied often to the engine, etc. And one of the ways to start to pull that apart is by using proxies to pull out sort of functionality of like, hey, I want to do data compression, or I want to do like access control, or I just want to be able to see metrics about what's going on. And so Quilkin is a project for that. Announced like a month ago, 2 months ago, something like that. It's not even that long.
Time no longer has meaning, so it's fine.
Time has no longer has meaning. But it's loads of fun, and they're a great crew to work with. Working on it, like it's a very specific technical sort of requirement project thing. So it's been really interesting to go deep on that topic, and it's been great because like my knowledge of UDP communications for games and some of the requirements around that, like it's okay, but I have a much deeper knowledge of that kind of stuff. So I've been able to learn a bunch in the process as well, which has also been super nice.
Awesome. We did have another question here from Theo, and this I assume is more directed at you, Mark. How are open source projects typically led and directed? Is there a leadership hierarchy, someone who leads the meetings, goals, needs? Because I think this goes back to your comment about, what do I work on kind of approach. So
April, is there a typical? I don't know if typical is a thing.
This is my beloved governance topic. So each open source project, basically, you have a agreement for how stuff's going to get done. And some of them are very complex. And that's because you have reached that level of the community growth, et cetera, that it needs to be that complex. I advise all projects when they get started of like, just write down how things are being done now, publish it. Because the most important thing in open source is that we're transparent. So even if decisions get made by, the creator's whim, that's fine, but it has to be documented and it has to be transparent so that everyone who's getting involved in the project is aware that that's the process. And then, as projects grow and things evolve, things change. So I think, to Theo's question about as terms of like a leadership hierarchy and someone who leads meetings and goals, it very much differs per project. But I think that, most projects are going to have that kind of, breakdown of like who is the maintainers is typically what we refer to. Sometimes they're referred to as owners. Those are the folks that basically are deciding what goes into the actual code base. And then you have people that might lead a working group for bigger projects. Like Kubernetes, for instance, there's 60 something different working groups or SIGs that they have going on. And each one has a leader and then a team lead and all these other different roles that fit in. So it really varies. But the important thing is it's documented somewhere. And each project, some folks specifically have created a, role type for like someone who's going to lead a meeting, someone who's going to, collaborate documentation requests and things like that. So it just depends. But every project you go to should have a README that gives you the basics, should have a file on basically contributing, which a lot of times is just like, this is how you need to set up your, words, how you set up, your
environment.
Yes, thank you. I don't know why I couldn't. I was picturing it all, but I couldn't say environment. And so, a lot of times it also includes things like check the issues, and there might be a good first issue and stuff like that. But most of the time it's pretty simple. If you want to put something in, you make a pull request, and then it's reviewed. And they, each project has its own process for like how many people have to review, and then what's the process for when it gets merged and all that. But it should all be very well documented. I would say, if you're finding an open source project that those things are not fully documented, that should be not necessarily a red flag, but that's just something to keep in mind before you invest a ton of your time and energy into it, because there's nothing worse than, investing a lot of yourself and then finding out like, oh no, that was never going to get put in the project because I didn't submit it, on the right day, or I don't like dogs or whatever,
A lot of times there's a roadmap too that you can, that gives you the idea.
Yeah. Sometimes.
Yeah. Certain open source projects,
I don't
know. maybe not so much in the gaming.
Our projects don't have those. No.
But typically in open source, you'll see a roadmap on certain projects where here's things that I want to add eventually.
Yes.
Yeah, yes. I mean, for the ones that have definitely got that level of maturity, like Istio is a project I work with as well, and there's a specific technical committee that's literally what they're doing. And so you do have that ability to have a group that's focused on creating that roadmap and laying that scope out, but not all projects do. So it just depends. And I always say also, like, just because it's governance is, I kind of, it's very US centric, I know, but I compare it to the Constitution of, it's the rules for how stuff gets done. And it's a big, scary thing theoretically, but it's not set in stone. Like, you can always change it. And, when you join a new open source project, you're going to find that as it grows and as things happen, like, you're going to want changes to happen. And again, that's just a proposal and that's a conversation. Never hurts to, propose that something get changed. So,
yeah, I would, what was I going to say? I would say the benevolent dictator model is probably quite prevalent, right? So whoever sort of built the thing in the first place tends to be the one who leads it in a benevolent dictatorship fashion. But I would also say that general consensus, which I put like in a very hand wavy way, is probably also like, you're like, hey, I want this thing because I need it in this project. You start an issue, you discuss it. If there's a few people who are like, this sounds like a good thing and we want to work on it, then that's general coalescing of opinions and bringing design decisions to bear and that kind of stuff. And that's honestly how pretty much most of our stuff works.
Yeah, and that's where I was going to pull this comment here from Anthony, where his open source community really benefited from what both Mark and April were talking about on establishing that governance and having that written language of here's how our project works. And that's great to see that real world example from even though our experts are talking about it, a real world example that it is actually working out in the field too. We did have another question, so this is kind of a hybrid question, so I'm going to answer the first part of it. So Sahil asks, what are some open source rules and guidelines? So we did have 2 previous episodes on open source, where open source licensing and getting started with open source. So I would suggest go back and check out those episodes on understanding, getting going with open source there. But is there anything on how to get started in open source that Mark, April, that you think would be
always read the contributing guide and follow it.
Yeah.
Always for every project.
Yeah, I mean, each project, of course, is going to have its own separate ones. But in terms of like broad scope, there's a book called Forge Your Future with Open Source. And that's literally like, that's going to give you kind of there are some fundamental aspects of open source, one of which being transparency, things like that. So that's, a good guideline to kind of get started with. There's also like opensource.org is a website for the, open source software conservative. I can't even remember now. But they are the ones that effectively, like when we talk about open source, there are specific guidelines for what constitutes open source and what doesn't, which Hillary probably covered in the licensing episode. And so that is actually the governing body that determines, what is open source and what isn't. But a lot of that has just the education on like you said, I'm curious, how do I get started? We try to do, a lot of those kind of like 101 open source sessions. Just the other Google, opensource.google, we give you all of the internal documentation that Google has for Googlers about doing open source. We've also made available externally. I freely admit it needs to be edited. There are a lot of times where we'll reference like links that but work with us. We're working on it. But the content is there, the basics are there, kind of like the things you need to consider if you want to create a new open source project, things like that. There's tons of, resources and information. The Linux Foundation is a big foundation that, does a lot, of course, in this space. And they're the ones that, for instance, we've talked about Kubernetes a lot. They're the ones that, own and maintain the project of Kubernetes. And they've got a lot of great documentation on just kind of like what open source is and how to get started. Oh, and it's funny, I mentioned the Linux Foundation owns Kubernetes. There's also Linux, if you're familiar with that at all. It's kind of in the name. Weird. Yeah. Shows you where my mind is most days. But yeah, so that's another great, resource for kind of like, what are those, standards across open source? Obviously, every project is going to be different, but that's a good source for kind of getting that framework for when we say open source and when we talk about working in open source, what we mean.
Definitely.
Yeah. And speaking of Linux Foundation, they do run like a bunch of training as well. So especially if you're working at a company and maybe you have lawyers or something like that, like gaming lawyers love to say no to things because it's easier. So if you're looking for that kind of, I can't remember what they have available right now, but it's worth checking to have a look to see if like you want either specialized or generalized training, if it's something you want to explore more from a company perspective, especially.
Yeah.
Definitely. And we are coming up close on time, so I wanted to have both of you offer a final thought around how can our listeners get involved in this open source gaming, with Google or just in general. What do you recommend there? How do they get started?
I would say pick a project, pick an area you're interested in, and then just show up. Like we said, showing up is 75-80% of the work, if not more. But whether it's our projects or there's a lot of other, around engines in particular, there's a lot of different options of things to get involved with. But I definitely think that if you're especially someone who is interested in perhaps pursuing a career in game development, that open source offers an amazing avenue into that to learn about so many of the different aspects of what it's like to work at a game studio, what it's like to, publish a video game. And you also, again, you cannot put a price on the actual connections that you make by being part of these communities. It's huge. So just, jump on in, and everybody's generally very welcome to have you. And we'd love to, have more folks get interested and get involved. So. Yeah,
I will probably second a lot of that. Pick your need. What are you passionate about? What do you need to learn? What do you want to do? What are your goals? Make sure you know what your goals are. what you want to get out of it, and then see if you can find a project that aligns with your goals. Seems to be like, if you're someone who wants to get started in a particular area, maybe you'll look for a project that works in that particular area. It's a great way to test the waters, see if it's something you're actually interested in. If you want to learn about how engines get made, like go play with it, like in an engine, like go see what the community, and then you'll be like, oh, this is actually cool, or no, it's not, or that's fine. You go, better to learn now than later. There's all sorts of stuff. I mean, like there's everything from engines that are open source. There's stuff like Twine, which is like an open source tool for building narrative stuff. There's everything from sound and sound tooling, kind of stuff. I mean, like Blender and Audacity and stuff like that has been out there for a really long time. There's stuff that we work on the infrastructure side. There's all kinds of very interesting work going on out there. So yeah, check it out. Dip your toes in the water, see if you like it.
Definitely. And I lied a little bit there, so I thought that was final thought. But April, you did mention something to me a little earlier around careers, and so you talked about careers in open source gaming. Did you have a little bit more on that?
Yeah, I think especially if you are someone that might be interested in getting involved in this, like Mark said, it's a great way to test your interest. Actually, a lot of times we think we're interested in one thing and then we go and figure something else out. But it is a hard industry to just break into. And that is one of the great things about open source, is it gives you that ability to not only make those connections, but then you also have something you could theoretically put on a resume of saying, like, look, I did XYZ for this project that is, used in whatever. I mean, you're able to show that, you're able to work with a broad, team and things like that. So it's definitely something that, can give you those opportunities. And I think especially for, folks that might normally feel like it's not a good space for them, open source gives you definitely an avenue of, trying it out, getting involved without, feeling like you're taking on a whole lot at once. So.
Awesome. Thanks. Well, that's it. That's it for this month's episode of Between the Brackets. Hope all of you enjoyed learning about open source gaming at Google as much as I did. I want to thank you all for tuning in, and thank you to Mark and April for joining me today to talk about open source gaming. So thank you both.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much.
It was a pleasure having both of you. And I also want to send out a thank you to Danny and Medusha backstage, who are helping run the show, clicking all the magic buttons and all that. Join us again next time as we dive beyond the dev docs to explore fun and niche topics with the experts. Make sure to subscribe to our channel here. And if you haven't registered yet, you can go to goo.gle/between-the-brackets to catch up on our past episodes, as well as get a part of our mailing list to get notified about new episodes. We also have our survey, which I saw was already dropped in the chat, Google, so goo.gle/btb-survey. And that's where you can let us know what you thought about this episode, as well as what you'd like to see in future episodes. And with that, thank you all so much for joining us. And thank you again, April and Mark. It was great learning about open source gaming. Hope to have you back again soon.
Awesome. Thanks. Bye, everybody.
Thanks so much. See ya.